Welcome to this week's edition of Flashback Friday, your opportunity to get some good review by listening to episodes from the past that Jason has handpicked to help you today in the present and propel you into the future. Enjoy.
Welcome to Creating Wealth with Jason Hartman. During this program, Jason is going to tell you some really exciting things that you probably haven't thought of before and a new slant on investing. Fresh new approaches to America's best investment that will enable you to create more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine, self-made multimillionaire who not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. He's been a successful investor for 20 years and currently owns properties in 11 states and 17 cities. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to financial freedom. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show. This is your host, Jason Hartman, and this is episode number 315. I've got our investment counselor, Sarah, here. You've heard her on this show before, and we just got back from our Memphis Distressed Property Tour and Creating Wealth Boot Camp there. We did last weekend. Sarah, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, my pleasure. And boy, today's going to be an interesting show. Doug Wead is our guest today when we get to him in a few minutes. He's a presidential historian, philanthropist, public speaker, really interesting guy. He worked as special assistant to U.S. President George H.W. Bush, and he's an author of more than 30 books. So he's got a lot to say about economics and the political environment, how it influenced economics and history, and it'll just be a really interesting guest today. So stay tuned for that. We'll be back with Doug in a few minutes here, but first I wanted to just debrief on a couple of things. Number one, the tour. Number two, talk about that old malady that affects myself a lot. I have this malady, and I am trying to overcome it and recover from it. I get it once in a while, acutely sometimes, and it's very costly to me. And that malady is called the paralysis of analysis. And so I want to help our listeners overcome that one, if at all possible. But first, let's kind of talk about the tour and just get your impressions, Sarah.
Yeah, it was a great tour. A lot of familiar faces, some of our repeat clients.
We love our repeat guests.
They're so fun. You know, we had a great night on the town Saturday night, got to see some good old Memphis culture, had a great dinner. Of course, we had the boot camp Saturday all day, which was great.
And the big surprise was we went to one of your favorite restaurants, which is Benihana's, and that was a great dinner, you know, very entertaining. I'm always afraid those chefs will drop the knife as they're throwing it around in the air. And then when we got there, we heard that there was actually another Benihana's right around the corner that burnt down. So, you know, those Szechuan grills, there's a lot of flames and knives and food being tossed around. It's maybe a little bit risky, I don't know, but we fared okay. It was a great dinner.
I love to live on the edge.
Well, you're not very risky. You don't take too many risks when it comes to your investments. I think all of us at the company are pretty conservative about things, at least money-wise. Conservative is good, but you got to make sure you don't become so conservative that you miss opportunities. Here's an example. I was kind of thinking about this paralysis of analysis thing, and you know, I see it in my life how over the past years it's cost me so much money. And the listeners may know that one book that I really like is by Michael Masterson. That's a pen name, it's not his real name, but it's called Ready, Fire, Aim. And I've mentioned it before on the show, and I think it's a really good concept, and there's some really interesting things in that book that talks about how people that follow kind of the traditional path in life, how they usually get left behind, where people that just kind of jump in and do things and make stuff happen, more happens for them. And you know, when you look at it from an investment standpoint, when you look at income property as the investment, of course, I talk a lot about the concept of inflation-induced debt destruction and how inflation destroys the value of our savings, our stocks, our bonds, and our equity in real estate actually is attacked by inflation as well because it's denominated in dollars. But when you look at what's going on right now, I mean, it's a great example, Sarah, because we all pretty much agree that property in all of our markets is appreciating in price. And as it appreciates, that represents an urgency issue, a reason that people really need to treat their investments with some degree of urgency because of the lost opportunity and the fact that they will just have to pay more later. That's the likelihood. And no one can predict the future with certainty, but the likelihood is they will have to pay more later. And as such, it's not just that. If they have money in the bank or in stock accounts or bond funds or any of that stuff, it's being attacked by inflation. So let's take an example here. Let's say that an investor has, and depending on where you are in life, you can add a zero or remove a zero. I'll just use a number to give you an example. But say you have $1 million in liquid tradable assets, whether that be the bank, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, whatever, anything that's relatively liquid. So you've got $1 million, and most of us would agree that the inflation rate now is about 10% annually. And as such, if it's 10% annually, then let's just round it off for round numbers' sake. $1 million loses $100,000 annually to inflation. That money is debased, and you're losing $100,000 a year. Okay, and that's about $8,000 per month. Now, let's combine that with the fact that the property prices are increasing, and the numbers are all over the board. But just to use round numbers, and it may not be this high in the market you're looking at, it may be higher, it just depends, and this won't be sustained. But I'm just giving an example. Understand it, the numbers can change, but the math and the concept is the same. So let's say that the property is increasing in price by 10% annually. Well, even if you make a mistake and jump into a not so good property, and say the property, you buy 10 properties for that $1 million. Well, say that the overall debt service on those 10 properties is $1,000 a month, for example. Well, that means you would lose $10,000 per month. But when you combine the inflation rate causing the prices to increase and the value of the money that is in your stocks, bonds, mutual funds, or bank account to decrease, it's a double hit. You're basically losing 20% annually, or about, what is that, about $16,000 per month in the fact that you you have the opportunity cost of the money that is being attacked by inflation and the opportunity cost of the property that you didn't buy, versus a terrible mistake where you buy 10 properties and they're all vacant. I mean, that's like a worst case scenario. So as such, I mean, it really makes sense. Sometimes there is real wisdom in action, and that's my point of saying that. Your thoughts, Sarah?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, there's definitely a cost to waiting, and some investors have a target number. For example, I have to get 15% cash on cash. But if it takes you a year to find that property, I mean, you could have gone with something with 12% cash on cash and done just as well.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. And the scary thing is at the point, and look, I've been doing this a long time, longer than I want to admit. But the scary thing is that at the inflection point we're in now, with this government spending starting to create significant inflation, with a fake recovery, and I agree with some people that this is a fake recovery. Some people think it's a real recovery. I don't. I think it's an inflation-induced recovery. And that we are at an inflection point now, in my opinion. And as such, it only gets worse. I mean, look, folks, the RV ratios have been declining for 2 years. The cap rates have been declining for 2 years. The cash-on-cash return has been declining for 2 years. The overall ROI, or return on investment, has been declining for 2 years now. It was better 2 years ago. Don't you love these promoters that say, oh, there's never been a better time to invest in real estate? Sure there was. 2 years ago was better. But the likelihood is it's only going to get worse. And, Jim Rohn, one of my favorite speakers, and the late Jim Rohn, and business philosophers, is he says something about discipline. And it really applies the same way, because when we're investing, we've got to discipline ourselves to be willing to take a risk. And as we're doing this, Jim Rohn's statement applies. He says that the pain of discipline weighs ounces, and the pain of regret weighs tons. And I really fear that a lot of people that don't act now are going to have serious regrets. And, I was saying this 2 years ago. I was much less confident about it myself. But now I think it's pretty clear what's going on. So the Michael Masterson book, if you suffer from the malady of paralysis of analysis, I would recommend you read Ready, Fire, Aim by Michael Masterson. I'd love to get him on the show because I really did enjoy that book. And another thing is, way back on podcast number 43, I shared one of my favorite poems by Og Mandino, and it's called Seeds of Success in the book Mission Success, which is an out-of-print Fantastic book. If you can grab a copy on Amazon.com and read it, it's very short. It's very good. It's just an excellent book. You'll love it. But one of the things he says in the poem, and I'll just read a couple of passages, he says, "I will live as all good actors do when they are on stage, only in the moment. I cannot perform at my best today by regretting my previous act's mistakes or worrying about the scene to come. I will embrace today's difficult task, take off my coat, and make dust in the world. I will remember that the busier I am, the less harm I am apt to suffer, the tastier will be my food, the sweeter my sleep, and the better satisfied I will be with my place in the world." And folks, at some point, this is not an exact science. It's a bit of an art. You got to just jump in and do it. And that's the message for today. It's not the message of our guest. We're going to talk about something completely different when we get to our guest. But I just wanted to say that to people because you are losing money every single day. You're losing in three ways. You're losing the return on investment of the property's performance. You're losing because the money that you have that is sitting on the sidelines, even if it's in stocks or bonds, I say that's the sidelines, certainly in the bank, is being debased and attacked by inflation. It's diminishing in value, and the property prices are increasing. So you're getting a triple whammy. Whereas if you invest in it, even if it doesn't go well, you're probably going to do better than that.
Let's touch real quickly, Jason, on equity, because, I get emails from people stating or asking for properties with instant equity. And, we've talked about this before, and I think, now's a good time to take advantage of that. However, we believe that the property is worth, what you pay for it.
Yeah.
So,
right.
Instant equity, what are your thoughts?
We don't look at, there's a lot of, that's a great question, Sarah. There's a lot of promoters out there who are promoting properties that are below market, that have instant equity. We don't do that. Even though I have no doubt that many of our properties do really have instant equity. We've had many cases where properties have appraised, and not that the appraiser's right, because the appraisers come in low, they come in high, they're all over the board, but I'm just mentioning it, that have appraised for more than our clients are buying it. That's pretty rare because the appraiser knows what they're buying it for. So they rarely go above that. Why take a risk and say it's worth more? That's just not prudent from the appraiser's perspective. But certainly we've had many times where the insurance company who's insuring the property says it's worth more than it is, where they'll make the buyer insure it for a lot more than the purchase price. But we just won't advertise that way. We won't say that a property has instant equity. We just won't do it.
I mean, and even if it does, that doesn't mean you're going to be able to tap into that equity right away. There's a cost to doing a cash out refinance. If you're going to sell the property, there's a cost to sell the property, so usually you have access to that equity, after a period of time anyway.
Yeah, it usually doesn't work. But what I can certainly say is if you're buying the property, and it depends on the market, this does vary because construction cost varies from market to market. But if you're buying the property below the cost of construction, which generally is $75 per square foot in, most of our markets, it's somewhere around there. It might be $85 a square foot. It might be $70 a square foot. It might be $65 even. But if you're buying the property below the cost of construction, then you have some built-in upside for sure, in my opinion, because you have what we call regression to replacement cost. And that's not really the same as appreciation. We coined that term, regression to replacement cost. So just when the property is able to sell for the cost of constructing it, that's not the same thing as appreciation. Appreciation is a different element. So right there, I would say you have built-in equity.
Sure. And I honestly think that, buying below the cost of construction is going away as we see new construction, popping up in some of these markets.
That's one of the things I didn't mention. I said that the RV ratios are worse than they used to be. The overall return is worse. The cap rates are worse. The cash on cash is worse. Everything is less desirable than it was 2 years ago. Okay, the deals they just cannot be produced today like they were 2 years ago. And the same is true of being able to buy below construction costs. That is fading quickly. If you can do it, hey, and you don't take action, I bet you're going to have some serious regrets later. The world belongs to those who take action. It's been said that life is not a spectator sport. You got to jump in, you got to do stuff, or stuff doesn't happen. Hey, we've got to get to our guest, Sarah, and I know we've both got to run to various conference calls here, but let's talk about one property real quickly, and then let's get to our guest today.
Good deal. So I'll give you the rundown. I know you have it in front of you as well. So this property is in the Austin market, Austin, Texas.
You mean Awesome, Texas?
Awesome, Texas.
Love that
Yes.
place. Yeah.
And it's a beautiful little property. It's got a great curb appeal. If you're interested, you can email me and we'll send you the link to the pro forma. But it's got a great curb appeal. It was built in 2010. Purchase price is $155,000. Estimated rent $1,475 a month. Now the cost per square foot on this one, we were just talking about that, $90 a square foot. So, it's still less than $100 a square foot.
Well, you're in Austin. I mean, Austin is a premium market. It's a creative class city. It's like Denver. It's expensive. You're not going to achieve the kind of numbers in Austin that you will in, say, Memphis or St. Louis or Indianapolis or many of our other lower price markets. But this is a market with serious appreciation potential. Austin is a very desirable city. No one would deny that. And look at the positive cash flow here, projected at almost $2,100 annually. And Sarah, let's look at the overall return on investment here. 30% annually is the pro forma.
Yep.
And it'll take you about $44,500 to buy this property. And folks, I mean, look, like I always say, if it only goes half as well as expected and you make 15% annually, are you going to be disappointed? I mean, that's still great. It's a lot better than you're going to get probably anywhere else.
Yeah, and one thing to think about on this particular property is that it's newer construction, 2010. I mean, that was very long ago. So you're probably not going to have a lot in the way of maintenance on this property, which is one of the things I love about my Houston property that we bought brand new. I've had like $600 in maintenance in 6 years. Now, I probably got a little lucky there, but it's a nice passive investment. Not totally passive, but it's not very hands-on like some of the older construction deals we see sometimes.
Yeah, and I submit to everybody there's no such thing as a passive investment. Okay, you got to pay attention to everything you do with your money. That's the bottom line. But some are more passive than others, and we try to make it as passive as possible when you're a direct investor and you retain control, so you can't get ripped off by a bunch of crooked CEOs, investment bankers, boards of directors, and all the middlemen on Wall Street that are taking their cut off the top. Okay, Sarah, thanks. Let's wrap up and let's get to our guest, and we will be back with our guest in just less than 60 seconds. Remember, you're listening to Flashback Friday. Our new episodes are published every Monday and Wednesday.
Penny, sometimes I think of Jason Hartman as a walking encyclopedia on the subject of creating wealth.
Well, you're probably not far off from the truth, Rich. Jason actually has a 6-book set on creating wealth that comes with over 100 hours of the most comprehensive ideas on investing in business. They're in high-quality digital download audio format, ready for your car, iPod, or wherever you want to learn.
Yes, and by the way, he's recently added another book to the series that shows you investing the way it should be. This is a world where anything less than a 26% annual return is disappointing.
Jason actually shows us how we can be excited about these scary times and exploit the incredible opportunities this present economy has afforded us.
We can pick local markets that are untouched by the economic downturn, exploit packaged commodities investing, and achieve exceptional returns safely and securely.
I like how he teaches us how to protect the equity in your home before it disappears and how to outsource your debt obligations to the government.
He's recorded interviews with Harry Dent, Peter Schiff, Robert Kiyosaki, Pat Buchanan, Catherine Austin Fitz, Dr. Dennis Waitley, T. Harv Eker, and so many others who are experts on the economy, on real estate, and on creating wealth.
And the entire set of advanced strategies for wealth creation is being offered with a savings of $385.
Now, to get your Creating Wealth Encyclopedia series complete with over 100 hours of audio and 6 books, go to jasonhartman.com/store.
If you want to be able to sit back and collect checks every month, just like a banker, Jason's Creating Wealth Encyclopedia series is for you.
It's my pleasure to welcome Doug Wead to the show. He's a presidential historian, philanthropist, public speaker, and he was special assistant to U.S. President George H.W. Bush and an author of more than 30 books, including New York Times bestseller, All the President's Children, Triumph and Tragedy in the Lives of the First Families. Just a guy with a wealth of knowledge and involvement and very engaged in the liberty movement, and it's a great pleasure to have him on the show. Doug, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me on your great show.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. And I always like to give our listeners a sense of geography. Where are you located today?
I'm seated in my library in my home outside Washington, D.C. in the Virginia Fox Country.
Fantastic. Well, good. Good stuff. Well, tell us a little bit about your background and all the stuff you've done. I mean, working with George H.W. Bush, and I think you work closely with Ron Paul and Rand Paul as well, and just want to hear more.
Well, I got involved in philanthropy and helping the hungry and trying to feed starving people, and launched a couple of programs, helped co-start the Charity Awards in Washington, D.C., and in the process met a number of presidents, ended up writing a book for Ronald Reagan, his campaign biography. Nobody thought Reagan had much of a chance of winning the nomination back then, so no major New York publisher would take it, but a publisher across the...
That's amazing looking back that someone would think it would be tough for Reagan to win. He was one of the most revered presidents in modern history, I would definitely say.
In 1979, my agent took it to all the major New York publishers, and he got back to me and he said, they don't think he's going to survive the Iowa caucuses. I said, what do you mean? I mean, George Bush was, Ambassador Bush then was contesting and eventually won the Iowa caucuses. I said, I think he's got a great organization there. They said, no. You don't understand what we mean by survive. We don't think he's going to live through the Iowa caucuses. He's an old man. So when I wrote the book, Jason, it was the only one available. He was president of the United States, and there was no book available but mine. So by default, it sold real well, and I got a start. But that's how I began to meet these people through the work I was doing, the charities I started. I co-founded Mercy Corps, and they've now given away $2 billion in food and medicine around the world. And so through that, I met the Bushes after the Reagans, and that's how I got involved in public life.
Fantastic. And what have you noticed and learned over the years in doing that? I'm sure there's so many things. It's like, what a broad question. How can you even answer that easily? But, just some of the major ahas in political life and public policy too, what we should be doing, where we're going. I want to dive into all this stuff today with you.
Well, my major aha was in watching Ron Paul, Dr. Ron Paul in the debates. When he was bringing up the whole issue after 9/11 of why there was 9/11 in the first place and how America is perceived around the world, and it isn't very good. And I felt like I was the only person in the world who felt that way. I told my wife in 1998 when a poll came out showing George W. Bush as the front runner for the presidential nomination, I said to my wife, if he wins the Republican nomination, we will go to war with Iraq, and we will kill Saddam Hussein, and we will kill Saddam Hussein's two sons. And because Saddam Hussein had tried to kill his father, had ordered the assassination of his father in Kuwait at the commemorative celebration of the victory there. And I concluded, I don't think that's a good reason to go to war. I don't want my nephew dying. I think it was awful they tried to assassinate former President Bush, but I don't want my nephew dying for war about that. So when I saw Dr. Paul challenge the war in that debate, I spit the Cheerios through my nose. I was watching it the morning after the retake, eating a bowl of cereal for breakfast, and I thought, who is this guy? Boy, he's got guts. And until then, I thought I was all alone in the world. So that was my aha moment.
So you're really referring to the blowback issue then, right?
Yeah, I am. But once Dr. Paul is a great provocateur. He says these odd, weird things. Like once I heard him say, the Federal Reserve spends more money than the U.S. Congress. And I thought, huh? What is he talking about? What does he mean? And when I finally figured it out, it drove me to Google, which that's what Dr. Paul does. He drives you to Google. and then you discover it for yourself, and you have the pride of authorship and the pride of self-discovery, and that's why his followers are so fanatical. when I studied it myself, I realized what he was talking about, and I thought, wow, this is pretty amazing. I know most of the members of Congress, and I follow their ups and downs politically and their election and with bated breath on election night, and I don't even know who the members of the Federal Reserve are, and they're spending more money than the U.S. Congress. So the whole process has been an education for me.
Yeah, well, the Federal Reserve is, in my opinion, a scam. Central banks in general, all they do is ultimately impoverish people. They do it slowly through inflation by basically just chipping away at their wealth. Sometimes they do it very quickly through inflation. It depends which central bank you're talking about. But it's just crazy that Ron Paul couldn't get an audit of the Fed. That's just nonsensical in today's world, that something so big and so powerful can be just hidden from view, and we don't know its real motivations. It's obviously a private corporation. The Rothschilds are the wealthiest family on the planet by far. I mean, when we look at Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Carlos Sims, those multi-billionaires, that's nothing compared to the central banking cartel, is it?
Well, it's more than astonishing. It's tragic. I mean, George W. Bush went in to kind of right the wrongs and complete some of the leftover business of his father. One of those was read my lips, no new taxes, and then taxes were raised. And so for George W., it was very important that he reduced taxes, and he was able to drive home this idea of the Bush tax cuts. We still talk about the Bush tax cuts, and it's so ironic and so tragic because the war in Iraq, we now know it's somewhere around $1.7 trillion now and keeps climbing. It wiped out the wealth of the nation. So he didn't raise taxes, but he took away the value of our homes. It was wiped out. The net worth of millions of Americans was lost. Their IRAs were ruined. We talk about the destruction of the middle class, and now we're beginning to understand how all this impacts the poor, how the poor are devastated by inflation and by these hidden taxes of monetary manipulation. But I also point out that a lot of the rich got wiped out. I mean, there were a lot of people that were wealthy that had their retirement in place and real estate, all of that working for them, and they're broke. They're living off their kids, and it was all wiped out. So the wealth of the nation really was just wiped out.
Here's the question, though, first, really. Maybe if we just back up from that a little bit, maybe the real thing to consider, and this is open to debate, was the wealth really there in the first place? Was it just really smoke and mirrors wealth? I like to try to make the distinction between what I call the real economy and the fake economy, which is the Wall Street economy, and the financial services economy, which is just smoke and mirrors. So I always kind of question, how do you define wealth? The same amount of goods were in the world before and after the financial crisis. That didn't change. There's the same amount of gold, the same amount of oil, the same amount of real estate. It's all there. It's just how we count it and how we value it. So I don't know. It's just sort of an interesting thing to ponder. Maybe it's a little too theoretical and esoteric, but I don't know. I just kind of find it interesting.
I think it's it's very, very central. Wealth, of course, is what is in demand. That's what wealth is, and that's why wealth has often been gold, because it was in demand as an exchange. Wood was in demand in the Middle Ages in Europe and especially in England, and so a man who stole from another person's wood pile was hung. In the American West, a man who stole another person's horse was hung.
Whatever is most in demand, yeah.
It's what's in demand that drives, and the British Empire became extremely wealthy because it used its colonial labor to extract God's wealth from the soil, from the ground, lumber, timber, tea, and exchange it on the way. Those ships came from all over the world and brought those raw materials, that wealth, to Great Britain. And for a long period of time, it was, for 100 years anyway, it was economically dominant in the world because of what you just described, real wealth, as opposed to the illusions of markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if America was really ever as prosperous as anybody thought it was. I think it's definitely prosperous when you look at real things, when you look at hard assets, but so much of it is just kind of fiction. I love it when people in the Wall Street world, they talk about financial innovation. Every time I hear that, Doug, it scares me. Because I know another God, all we need is another financial innovation, another derivative.
America's wealthy because it has power. And if you're in the neighborhood and you're the only person in the neighborhood with a gun, and it's a time of anarchy, you have power. And we have the gun. We may lose it, but right now we have the gun. So, and we account for, 43% of the world's military expenditures. We have 50,000 jets. I think our nearest competitor is China with 5,000 jets. It is a real scam. The Pentagon contractors are making a lot of money.
Yeah. Isn't it unfortunate, though, that as long as central banks and the military-industrial complex is profiting off war, we're just unlikely to ever have peace, aren't we?
Yep, there's a motive for it, isn't there?
I remember a great book that I read a long time ago called The Greatest Management Principle in the World. And you sum up all of life pretty much in this statement. He said, what gets rewarded gets repeated. And that's the problem with our social welfare systems and the problem with the peace problem and the military. I mean, what do you think of what's going on geopolitically nowadays with Iraq and North Korea? Are these enemies, in quotes, are they sort of almost produced by us potentially, or, are they real? I just gotta always question myself about that.
I love history, so I read a lot of history, and life is too short. You don't have enough years to live to read all of history. So it's at times it can be a frustrating pursuit. But it's so shocking to see us repeat. If you go back to the Nuremberg trials, Larry Jackson, our prosecutor, who was Jewish, who was a very talented attorney and prosecutor and Supreme Court justice. And so he goes back to argue at the Nuremberg trials, and he spends the whole day on the blood purge on June 30th when Hitler took out the terrorists. The SA, the fear of the military in Germany was that this would be a second revolution, and the SA would seize power from Hitler. And so Hitler put them down and actually fired the gun, killed one of the SA leaders, and the rest were arrested, and approximately 300 of them were killed. And it's called the Night of the Long Knives or the Blood Purge, June 30th. And so at the Nuremberg trials, he brought this up to show that Hitler had violated his own constitution, his own laws to kill a person, and the nation applauded it. And even many people around the world applauded it because he was putting down possible terrorists and another revolution in Germany. And that's what comes to mind when we've authorized our president, we haven't authorized him, but
he's taken the power. You're going to mention the drone killings, right?
Yeah, he's taken the power to kill people. I mean, just a few years ago, you had to have a judge's signature before he could bug your phones. Now he can kill you. It's stunning. It is stunning.
It's amazing how quickly the freedom and due process it's just evaporating, isn't it?
Yeah, and Larry Jackson's point at the Nuremberg trial, he spent a whole day saying this was the slippery slope when Hitler, without a trial, executed someone, and the whole country applauded it. This was the slippery slope. And I think of that now, and I think, good Lord, where are we?
Right. Yeah. Where do you think we're going with all? Well, before we get there, let me just ask you economically. I want to talk about an economic issue and maybe just share with you a little bit of an email that I sent to a friend a couple of days ago. I had a couple of friends arguing over on an email thread. They're always debating these economic issues. They're pretty fun to watch in on. Sometimes they get a little bit nasty with each other, but they're good friends. But very spirited debates. And they posted the article from Zero Hedge about Obama saying that 3 million was all anybody needs to retire and $205,000 per year in nominal dollars. It's interesting that they pointed out nominal dollars. It's very interesting they defined that so specifically and really scary, not just interesting. But they're going back and forth about how, America is in decline and I'd rather live in China. I remember Jim Rogers talking about how, I've had him on the show, talking about how China is more free and capitalistic than the United States nowadays. And, honestly, Doug, I really disagree with that. I think that the U.S. is headed in many wrong directions. But when people look at the math and say, oh my gosh, we've got $16 trillion in debt, we've got 60 to 120 trillion or maybe even more in unfunded entitlements and future expenditures that we can never possibly pay for in real dollars. So the likelihood is we're going to inflate our way out of the mess, as has been done, and I hate to say this, successfully historically so many times.
Yeah, and recently.
And recently, yeah. It seems to be a good business plan ultimately, and I want you to comment on that recently thing, but let me just tell you what I said. It's a really quick thing. It says, it seems illogical, but math doesn't matter much when you have the world's reserve currency, the largest economy, and the most powerful military to keep it that way. Massive natural resources, exceptional geography, the international language, and a 230-plus year, quote, brand, unquote, that is synonymous with freedom, innovation, stability, and opportunity for 7 billion people. Yes, America is in decline, but it's going to take a very, very long time to dislodge those valuable assets. Am I being too optimistic? You were chuckling at me.
I just think that's just a brilliant synopsis.
Yeah.
And it's our problem. But yeah, I think you summed it up really well. I mean, I look at, we torture people and we just applaud it and we think it's just great. We go to movies and cheer it. Now, if there's scary music and the people torturing them are in black shirts and they're Nazis, we are just outraged and we wondered, how would people put up with this?
How could they be so cruel, Yeah.
But we just love it. When it's us torturing them, we got good reasons. Well, now you know how the Germans felt.
We claim to have the moral high ground.
Yeah, but boy, you summed it up well when you described the brand, which has endured, and the currency, and you're right. That seems like it would take time. The only thing is, some things can happen very quickly when the economy is in trouble. You look at the last depression, not this one, but the one before, and that saw the rise of communism, the rise of fascism. The world was a cataclysmic time. That's what a Great Depression can do. And we're going through a Great Depression now, so my hope is that we'll have cataclysmic events that'll take us back to authentic constitutional government. So I'm hoping that maybe the dramatic can happen.
Is there any chance to get back? I mean, how would that work? I mean, how would it happen? I think it would happen with strong secession movements probably. But what are your thoughts? How would we go back?
Well, I think we, in a sense, we are going to start going back. What we have to keep in mind is it's not the Federal Reserve as much as it's human nature. And we can add systems and change the systems, and in corruption in one place, it'll just pop up somewhere else. So we're not going to change human nature, and there will always be people who will take the trillions and let everybody else starve. You're going to have that. You're going to have capital cronyism, where the marketplace and people in it are cheated. But at least we can make them move. We can force them to close down this part of corruption and open it up somewhere else. I think that's happening. I mean, when you've got 80% of the country now favoring an audit of the Federal Reserve, you watch, it won't be long till Obama and all the Republican nominees are going to call for it, and Biden, and it won't be a real audit, but it'll be the window dressing version of an audit, right? Yeah, at least 80%. It's something. Yeah. So we're seeing some movement now. You look at the way they treated Rand Paul compared to the way they treat their dad, and it lets you know two things are going on. One, the country has moved pretty dramatically. Dr. Paul was able to move it in that last election, and there are more people sympathetic to these ideals of liberty. That's one thing. And the second thing is, some of the pundits who went out on a limb attacking Dr. Ron Paul are pulling their punches with Rand Paul, because the fact that it's Rand, it's giving them a chance to revisit these principles and change their mind, and they're doing it. I'm talking about people like Bill Kristol and others who are publicly saying more respectful things of Rand than they did of his dad. It's kind of like they're able to save face and yet adjust some of their views.
So why are they being? So what you're saying is they're being kinder to Rand than they were to Ron. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yes, and I think part of it is because they sense the public has changed. I don't think it's all the rhetoric, but they sense the public has changed and they sense they can do this. For example, Dr. Paul would talk about the end of foreign aid and why we need to, and really great language. Dr. Paul's definition of foreign aid, as you know, is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. And it really is.
That's a great definition too. You look at the UN oil for food scam. I mean, just it's scam after scam after scam, and all it does, it just stays at the top in these developing countries. I mean, it's so unfair.
And even Israel's aid, as you know, comes back to the United States, to the lobby in the United States.
Right.
Lobbies for aid to Israel are the people who make the money when Israel turns around and takes that money and buys stuff from companies in the United States. So it's corporate welfare. It's oink oink, give me some of the taxpayers' money, and yet it's scammed as foreign aid. Well, Rand treated it very differently. He went to Israel. He said, "Here's one of our traditional allies. Here's a country whose instincts are the same as ours. We don't even have a formal treaty, yet we can count on Israel to stand up for the things we would believe in the Middle East. And yes, I'm against foreign aid. I think these countries should be weaned off of our foreign aid. We're broke, and we need to quit borrowing money from China and giving it to Pakistan. But I would start with our enemies. I would start by ending foreign aid with our enemies. Israel's the last one I'd stop the foreign aid to." Well, he's still saying the same thing Dr. Paul's saying, which is let's end foreign aid, even the foreign aid to Israel. But the way he put it is far more politically palatable in the United States and understood in the United States. And so some of the people that opposed his father find themselves now comfortably promoting Rand Paul because they see this is where the country's headed.
We'll be back in just a minute. Just a reminder, you're listening to Flashback Friday. Our new episodes are published every Monday and every Wednesday.
What's great about the shows you'll find on jasonhartman.com is that if you want to learn how to finance your next big real estate deal, there's a show for that. If you want to learn more about food storage and the best way to keep those onions from smelling up everything else, there's a show for that. If you honestly want to know more about business ethics, there's a show for that. And if you just want to get away from it all and need to know something about world travel, there's even a show for that. Yep, there's a show for just about anything. Only from jasonhartman.com. Or type in Jason Hartman in the iTunes store.
Everybody likes to write Ron Paul off, and not everybody, of course, but so many people do in the lamestream media. I love that phrase. And say, look, you can't be so isolationist in the modern interconnected world. I agree. I mean, I take kind of a middle ground on that. I think we're way too interventionist. I think we've got way too many military bases around the world. But don't you agree, though, that, I mean, Ron Paul's ideas were maybe just a little too far to the isolationist perspective?
I personally don't think so. I agree with Dr. Paul on just about everything. I guess that...
Well, tell me why, though, because I haven't had a chance to ask him.
Well, one thing, I think that his views were not accurately explained, and he's a very kind person, and he's a teacher more than he is a politician.
I agree, and he's so consistent too. He's so honorable compared to everybody else.
For example, he didn't want to end the Federal Reserve, and if you'll YouTube that question over and over, you'll find him saying every time he's he's interviewed, no, I don't want to end the Federal Reserve. I want to phase out its influence, and I want it transparent and audit as a first step. And he goes in, so it's a little bit different than it's portrayed by the media, and then even some in the own liberty movement believe. So, I mean, I disagreed with him, for example, on the whole issue of drugs, and argued with him a little bit about it. But I've come down on the same side with him on that issue. I mean, you stop and think. I was reading Anne Bloom's book on Gulag, her Pulitzer Prize winning book on the Gulags, and she categorizes everything that happened. It's a wonderful book. But she gets to the Great Terror, when Stalin had so many people in the gulags in prison that the economy couldn't sustain it, so he had to kill them off. So they started working them to death. So here are these people in Siberia and all these concentration camps strung out all over the Soviet Union. He's going to kill them all because there's too many of them. How many did he have in the gulags? Well, the best estimate is at that point 1 million Soviet citizens were imprisoned, including children, and many children were born into the gulags.
And the question to ask is, and you may not know this, but what was the population of the Soviet Union way back then? You know, it was much lower. Well, I don't know. You know, that country has...
It was about 250 million. That's what it was then. So today, our population imprisoned, as you may know, is 1.5 million people. We have more people behind bars than they had during the Great Terror, and by far the vast majority of them are in prison over marijuana. Now, I've never smoked or I've never tasted marijuana, inhaled or otherwise, and so I'm not just a big marijuana wanting to promote marijuana, but I think this is ridiculous to incarcerate so many of our people. So I've tended to agree with him on a lot of things. I think violent criminals ought to be pulled off the street, and white-collar criminals ought to pay for their crimes and have their wages garnished and productive. I think we ought to, our system ought to gear more towards the victims of crime and less than this warehousing of bodies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So with the drug issue, should we just treat that as a social problem the way the Europeans do and stop criminalizing all of it? It's just ridiculous, the amount of money we're spending on that. But what scares me with the prison system is so much of it has become private. Now we've got these incentives again, and we've got these iron triangles forming, just like the public employee unions in California. You know, it's another bunch of interest, and there's a prison lobby, and they're looking out for their own interest. How can they get more customers, which means more prisoners?
Yeah, Jason, it's the point you made earlier. What the quote you used? What gets rewarded gets
repeated. Yeah, it does. But what do we do about it? That's the question.
Well, exposing it is the start, and I guess I'm so new to the liberty movement. I have a little more hope than some of the old timers do. Some are pretty cynical about it, and some almost kind of want us to lose. I think they want martyrdom. I'm finding there's a lot of chains in the liberty movement. There's a lot of things you can't do. They don't want you to do. It's pretty tight culture, but I'm enjoying it and learning so much, and feel rather ashamed of myself for coming to it so late.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you're involved and that you're helping get these ideas out there, Doug. But anything you'd like to say in closing, just to kind of wrap up with?
No, but I loved your earlier synopsis. I hope you've got that captured.
Yeah, I do. I'll email it to you.
That's really good stuff. That sums it up.
Yeah, I just think, as negative as I am about things, and the way they're working, overall, I think the demise of America has been vastly overstated. I think it's going to take a long, long, long time before we see the big collapse that everybody keeps talking about.
Well, that may be true, but what I'm afraid of is we may have had a collapse of freedom. The country may endure. My wife is French, and she was asking me the other day. She was saying now George W. Bush is a conservative Republican. I said, yeah, that's what they say. She says, now Now, when I was in France, Francois Mitterrand ran for president. He wanted to nationalize the banks, and we called him a socialist. There was no shame in that. He was elected. He was the socialist president of France, and my dad was on the board of a bank, and so it was hotly debated, but we did nationalize the banks in the country, and we backed away from it after a few years, but that was a big debate, and it was the socialist government of France. But your president, George W. Bush, he nationalizes the banks, and you call him a conservative Republican. I don't get it.
Right. Well,
I had to say to my wife, well, I don't get it either.
Yeah, it's hard to explain that one, but then also they'll make the argument that they didn't really nationalize the banks by bailing them out, of course. But that's a whole nother discussion, my friend. Yeah, but I agree. I think the collapse of freedom is very much there. They have so many laws. John Stossel did an interesting show on this. You probably caught that, I bet. And it was about how what I've been saying for many years. There are so many laws that we're all violating laws all the time nowadays. My mother, growing up, I remember she used to say to me, ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Yeah.
But you can't possibly know all the laws nowadays, especially if you're in business. It is so immensely complex. I mean, they've always, in other words, the government always has something on us nowadays.
And it's meant to be that way.
Yep.
You know, it's kind of like click here. I have read this and I agree. And
nobody reads it, of course. Yeah.
And that's what's happened to our laws. You're right. And everybody's vulnerable. And it's in business. It's the same way. You sign the contract and you accept the P&P, the procedures and policies of the company, and they are designed to immediately make you vulnerable and at their mercy.
Yeah. Hey, just since you mentioned that, one more thing. I hope you've got a minute to talk about this. But I watched a documentary last year called Hot Coffee, and it was about the Stella issue, the McDonald's lady who spilled the coffee on her lap. And it's just amazing how maligned that whole story was. I finally heard the other side of it. But the upshot, one of the big takes I got from it, and what I'm really thinking a lot now about nowadays, is how these large companies, in their contracts, they force us into these arbitration clauses. And these arbitrations are basically kangaroo courts for the big customers, their repeat customers, these companies, and the consumer just doesn't have any rights, no due process anymore. And, you know, we all say, oh, there's too much litigation and it's just clogging up the courts, frivolous lawsuits. I know, everybody knows that is true. But my gosh, it's like the consumer has really, when I think it was Scalia on the Supreme Court was the deciding justice on that. I could be wrong on that, by the way, but I think it was. It's like the consumers just lost their freedom. They lost their rights. And then, you know, you add to that the fact that we're going to have drones flying around spying on us. That's the legal system. It's not the government directly, but it does matter.
It matters. The meat tainted and on and on. You could go on and on and on. And we've got tumors and cancers popping up all over, and no real competition among the watchdogs that check our produce and food, and some of the most basic things now are under attack. It's interesting times, and my feeling is people in the Ron Paul movement kept referring to a revolution. I felt it was a counter-revolution. I believe the revolution happened under my friend George W. Bush and Barack Obama. I think we've had a change of government and a counter-revolution to go back to the U.S. Constitution is what we need now. I think we've already left behind the U.S. Constitution. It's treated like youth camp rules. You got to be in bed at 10 o'clock. Wink, wink. Lights out. Wink, wink.
And selective enforcement of those rules. So the government always has something on you. But what's interesting, you talk about the tainted meat and the pharmaceutical industry and stuff. It's just unbelievable that all of these people that work for these various government agencies, it's particularly common on Wall Street. I mean, what a bunch of criminals that whole enterprise is. You go and investigate a company, and it's basically a way to apply for a job.
It's a revolving door.
Yep, because these regulators, they get hired away by the big giant corporations, and they know that if they bust them, if they're on their case too much, they're not going to get a job offer. I mean, it's total conflict of interest.
Yep, it is. It is. It's a revolving door.
Well, keep up the good work, my friend, and keep
Jason.
saying the things you do. And thanks so much for joining us. Any websites you want to give out, or any of your books that you want to recommend? Tell people where they can get them. Anything like that?
Well, just DougWead.com, DougWead.com.
Excellent. Well, Doug Wead, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. It was great.
This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company, all rights reserved. For distribution or publication rights and media interviews, please visit www.hartmanmedia.com or email media@hartmanmedia.com. Nothing on this show should be considered specific personal or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own, and the host is acting on behalf of Platinum Properties Investor Network, Inc. exclusively.